Welcome to this self-knowledge course. Today we will be talking about self-observation. We will learn how to develop the sense that will allow us to achieve a radical transformation in ourselves. What is self-observation? Observing yourself is learning to consciously direct your attention to your inner world. And this is the greatest capacity that we can develop, because if we learn to really observe ourselves, and if we learn to discover ourselves at all times through intimate self-observation, we will be able to make real changes in ourselves. Through self-observation, we can achieve great changes in our way of thinking, feeling, and acting. And therefore, we will be able to awaken and develop our consciousness. Whereas, if we continue just observing the outside world, as we have done so far, just watching what others do, we can never generate a change in our lives, since the only person we can change is ourselves. And a real change begins by directing our attention inward, to observe what we do, what we say, what we think and what we feel. By doing that, we can discover the internal reason for our actions, reactions, words, thoughts, and feelings. And by discovering them, we will have the opportunity to transform ourselves, eliminating our incorrect ways of being. And the only way we can make ourselves aware of all that inner activity is by practicing the self-observation. To get to really know ourselves, we need to start by observing ourselves. So, we are going to analyze this topic in depth to understand what self-observation is. Because we can think that we already know what self-observation is. But we are going to see that we tend to confuse self-observation with knowing and with thinking, and it is not the same. We are also going to see that external observation is very different from internal observation. Therefore, I invite you to analyze and reflect on this topic, in order to come to a clear understanding of what self-observation really is, and to begin to actively practice it in your daily life to really start a process of self-knowledge. We must understand that knowing and observing are different. We can say that we know something or someone, but that does not mean that we have actually observed it. For example, we might know that we are sitting on a chair in a room, but this does not mean that we are observing the chair. We can also know, at any given moment, that we are in a negative internal state, perhaps with a problem, or worried about this or that matter, or in a state of restlessness, or uncertainty, etc. But this does not mean that we are observing it. Or we could feel antipathy towards a person, we could say that we know that person and we don't like him. However, we have never really observed that person. In the case of a person to whom we feel disliked, just like that, because we feel like it and often for no reason. If one observes oneself, one can notice the multitude of thoughts that accumulate in the mind, the group of voices that speak and shout disorderly within oneself, what they are saying, the unpleasant emotions that arise within us, the unpleasant taste that all this leaves in our psyche, etc. Obviously, in such a state, we also realize that internally we are treating the person we dislike very badly. But in order to see all this, attention is unquestionably needed, intentionally directed within oneself, not passive attention. We must not confuse knowing with observing. And many confuse self-observation with knowing. Self-observation, which is 100% active, is a means of self-change, while knowing, which is passive, is not. Observing yourself requires a conscious effort. While knowing, as it is passive, is not an act of attention. We even make the mistake that when we think we already know something, we stop observing it, and thus, we stop discovering it. We can see that when we were children, we looked at things because we wanted to discover them, and back then, everything was magical. Once we grow up and think we know it all, we lose the magic. Because we stop observing things, and that is why we stop discovering things, we stop discovering life and magic in all things every day. And we did the same with ourselves. We created a personality, and, as we saw in the last lesson, we identified with that personality. And now we believe that we know ourselves and, therefore, we no longer really observe ourselves. We do not observe what happens in our inner world to discover who we really are beyond our desires and appearances. Attention directed inwards is certainly something positive and active that leads us to discover ourselves at any time, in any circumstance. When we begin to observe ourselves, every situation in life becomes an opportunity to discover ourselves, to discover those ways of being that lie within us, to discover our own ways of reacting, the causes of those reactions, and to make a change. So, we are no longer going to go against people or situations, but against every wrong way of being that we find within ourselves. Thinking and observing are also very different. Anyone can think of himself what he wants, but this does not mean that he is actually observing himself. I could think of myself as a very loving person, but I probably haven't noticed that behind this loving act, there is the fear of loneliness and tyranny, because now that loved one cannot simply stop loving me, or leave whenever he wants, because if he does, I'll cry, I'll feel miserable, and I'll try to make him feel miserable. So, am I really loving? Or do I just think that I am loving? I might also think of myself as a very honest person, and that others are thieves. That the rulers are thieves because of the taxes they apply, also that those who run service companies are thieves, just like bankers, or the one I saw on the news who robbed a store. But I think that I am a very honest person. But have I observed my own thief self? Have I observed that I still have what someone lent me, and I haven't returned it? Or that money that someone lent me a long time ago, and I haven't paid it, because I think that person forgot it, or doesn't need it, or I think he can wait? Have I observed my own dishonesty, when seeking to take illicit advantage of a business? Or when I find money on the floor, and take it even though I know it doesn't belong to me? So, we can see that we can think anything about ourselves, but this does not mean that we observe ourselves. Thinking and observing are very different. Self-observation is seeing our different eyes or psychological defects in action. When we are observing ourselves, our attention is divided between the observer and the observed. The observer is always our consciousness, that 3% of free and conscious essence that we all have. This will always be the observing side. And the observed side will be our thoughts, emotions, sensations, desires, reactions, etc., where the remaining 97% of the essence currently trapped in the ego is found. There, in our emotion, mind, and sex, is where all our psychological defects are manifested. And we need to see the different eyes in action, discover them in our psyche, understand that within each of them there is a percentage of our own consciousness, and regret having created them. Then we will see within ourselves all that train of thoughts, emotions, desires, passions, private comedies, personal dramas, elaborate lies, speeches, excuses, morbidities, lascivious pictures, etc. Many times, before falling asleep, at the precise moment of transition between wakefulness and sleep, we feel within our own mind different voices that speak to each other. It is the different eyes that must break at such moments all connection with the different centers of our organic machine in order to then plunge into the molecular world, in the fifth dimension. So, we can see that self-observation requires dynamic attention. It requires that we put our conscious part into activity at all times so that it acts as the constant observer of what moves in our inner world, so that we can proceed to eliminate them with psychological death. The consciousness that we are rescuing with psychological death comes to illuminate our inner darkness, so that we can advance in the liberation of the other essences. The released essences help to release the others. Then, we must begin to observe how each of our egos manifests itself in each of our centers. Observe the sensations that move in the sexual center. Observe the attraction and anxiety that, for example, moves in our instinctive center. Observe the feelings and desires in our emotional center. Observe our mind, our intellectual center, to discover the psychological defects that manifest in thoughts, leading us to fantasize, remember, plan, etc. And observe our motor center, to see everything we do or say moved by some psychological defect. That is being in a constant state of self-observation. This is how we must be at all times, to discover ourselves. And any defect that we discover, we must judge it to understand that it is not our consciousness manifesting itself, that it is a defect that is stealing our energy, and that therefore it must die. And for its elimination, we are going to ask the part of our consciousness in charge of eliminating the defects that we have discovered and understood in ourselves, which is our particular Divine Mother, to eliminate them. As we persevere in self-observation, this sense, which is our third eye, will gradually develop. We must also understand that observing and observing ourselves are completely different. However, both require attention. In observation, attention is directed outwards, towards the outside world, through the windows of the senses. The external world includes everything that is outside of our physical body, our work, family life, social relationships, everything that is external. And we can experience it through observation. Directing our attention outwards, through the five senses of external perception, touch, sight, hearing, smell, and taste. On the other hand, in the self-observation of oneself, the attention is oriented inward, and for this, the senses of external perception are useless. Our inner world is what is inside of us, our different ways of being, our feelings, thoughts, ideas, emotions, desires, hopes, disappointments, etc. All those things that are internal, invisible to the external senses, although for us they are more real than the dining room table, or the furniture in our living room. Who can tell us that the pain we are feeling at a given moment is not real, or that the thoughts in our mind are unreal? But this inner world can only be perceived through the sense of inner self-observation, which is to direct our attention inside oneself, and for this, the senses of external perception are useless. The two worlds, interior and exterior, are verifiable from experience. The outer world is the observable, while the inner world is the self-observable. The more we explore this inner world called oneself, the more we will understand that we are simultaneously living in two worlds, in two realities, the external and the internal. The starting point of official science, in its practical aspect, is the observable. While the starting point of conscious science, which leads to verify the reality of what resides within us, the different dimensions, the different bodies within us, the entire universe that resides in us. It is the self-observable. And those two starting points take us in two directions that are completely different. One could grow old and get stuck in the uncompromising dogma of official science, studying external phenomena, observing cells, atoms, molecules, suns, stars, comets, etc., without undergoing any radical change within himself. For the kind of knowledge that transforms someone internally could never be acquired through external observation. The real knowledge that can truly bring an inner change is based on direct self-observation. Because by observing the outside world we can only manage to modify the mechanical conditions of the world. But nothing that I can observe and change outside will change my interior, my ways of being, thinking, feeling, and reacting. The only way I can achieve an intimate change, a radical change in myself, is through self-observation and psychological death. And something to keep in mind is that external knowledge, which we can collect with our five senses of external perception, is extremely limited. While if we develop the sense of self-observation, we can achieve a deep knowledge of our inner world, which will allow us to achieve a deep knowledge of the inner worlds of planet Earth, the galaxy, and the universe. And that was reflected in that oracle at the entrance of the Temple of Apollo, in Delphi, in Greece. Where it said, "Man, know thyself and you shall know the universe and the gods." That allows us to understand that as we deepen in self-knowledge, great knowledge in relation to the world, the universe, and divinity, will open before us. So, we already see that what I am explaining here is not something new, but rather it is knowledge that has existed in all cultures. It is knowledge that has always existed so that each being achieves the purpose for which we descended into this physical existence. And that is the knowledge of the three factors of the revolution of consciousness, which will allow us to really know ourselves, to understand and eliminate each of the negative ways of being that we have created within ourselves, and that have trapped our consciousness, our wisdom, and our ability to love. And by doing so, we will be able to know and understand all the people in the world. But it will also help us to release and save all the energy that we need to create our internal bodies, which are the ones that will allow us to have a conscious presence in the higher dimensions of nature, and to investigate all the objective knowledge of the entire universe. That ability resides within each of us. I invite you to put self-observation into practice at all times, to begin to eliminate everything subjective from within, so that you begin to experience the reality of your inner world and the of the higher worlds of consciousness. In the next conference, we will talk in detail about the 3 factors of the revolution of consciousness, so that we are clear about the only 3 objective works that we must do if we really want to awaken our consciousness. Thank you very much for attending. See you in the next topic.